Thank you very much, Maria. I trust everybody can hear me and see the slides. Thanks for coming along. I apologise, my Icelandic is terrible, and my pronunciation is likewise not great. So if I say a few place names and you don't understand them, just please look at the text. So yeah, I'm Dr. Steve Carr, and I'm from Leeds University, and I shall be talking to you about mapping wilderness in Iceland. So just a quick outline. I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about Europe and how much of Europe's remaining wilderness is in Iceland. It's then probably worth spending a little bit of time looking at the different definitions of wilderness and how they match to your own wilderness definition in the Nature Conservation Act. And then think why protection is important. And I will give an example, and I think Maria already mentioned work with UFIG, with the Hvalávik and impact assessment in the Vestfjord. So I will be using that as an example. Now, I will then just sort of say a little bit about our current work, not much, I promise, because it's all work in progress at the moment, and do some conclusions. So just at the bottom there's just a reminder just for me to say, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very honoured to be able to give you this talk. If we look at some work that we did, which coincides, interestingly enough, with the date that your Wilderness Act, your Nature Conservation Act came into being, as 2013. We were working with colleagues at Wageningen University in the Netherlands and colleagues elsewhere in Europe to develop a wilderness register and an indicator. And the indicator was basically a European-wide map, mapping wilderness quality index. And one of the figures of merit, which should be of interest to you in Iceland, is that what we found was that 43% of Europe's top 1% wildest areas are actually found in Iceland. Now, this was based on mapping using a number of data sets available at a European scale, including corrine land cover and potential natural vegetation, grazing intensity, remoteness from settlements, and remoteness from mechanized access, and a few other things. And I'm just going to show some maps now, which show those patterns. So these are I'll start with the maps, the output maps, the final indicators, what we call a European wilderness continuum. In that, what it shows is it shows a continuum or a spectrum, if you like, of non-wild, so the artificial surfaces, the towns and the cities and our road networks, all the way through this color ramp here on the screen. I think I've got a pointer somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Let me just use a laser pointer. So this this color ramp here from a very low wilderness in the zero end up to these dark blue areas in the top 5% wildest areas. And what you see there is the pattern is clearly one of high latitude and high altitude. So you see the Alps and the mountains of Scandinavia, and the further north you go, the wilder it gets, and the higher you go, the wilder it gets. Kind of probably makes sense. What we also did was to then split that into top 1% wildest cells, 5% and 10%. And obviously your eyes have probably been attracted to what's going on in Iceland there. And sure enough, I do have some detail in a minute. But let's just look at the patterns of the data that's made up of. So we used naturalness of vegetation. Now, this was based on the corrine land cover information, but comparing that critically to a potential natural vegetation map. And that PNV is it's based on the climatic and the altitude and the soil conditions, and predicts what vegetation would be growing where in the absence of humans, so all our agriculture and our cities and things like that. But we also included grazing intensity, because we acknowledge that grazing animals are one of the largest impacts on ecosystems. We also included remoteness from access, so mechanized access, so main roads particularly, and also remoteness from human settlements and the absence of human influences. So these are some other maps which were included in the model. This is probably a little bit too much detail for this talk, but just to say that these data sets are along the top, and we put them into what we call a continuous linear multi-criteria model. So that basically means that we bring these data in, we keep the full range of data within the model, we weight them to different levels, so they might play different roles in the final map. And this is this linear multi-criteria evaluation model. So a lot of detail in there, and it's just to say how this is brought together and allows us to weight them and look at these patterns as a continuous ramp from most wild to least wild. Now, as I said, you probably wanted me to focus on Iceland, which is only natural. And this highlight this figure again of 43% of Europe's top 1% wildest areas are in Iceland. And okay, the dark blue here is the top 5%. But if we look at the next slide, we could see that the dark purple areas here are the top 1%. And of course, a lot of these areas are some of your ice caps, so the Vatnajökull and the Hofsjökull. And other ones around the Drangajökull up in the far north Westfjords. But there are still considerable areas of ice-free land in the highlands and other areas of Iceland which are in this top 1%, 5%, 10% wildest areas in Europe. So Iceland is well served in this regard. I think at this point it's useful to sort of take a step back and look at the definitions of wilderness in the various global, European, and then a national level. So at international level, and I was involved in writing the IUCN guidelines on what we call Category 1B wilderness protected areas, and the definition used there is that these are usually large, unmodified or slightly modified areas which retain their natural character and influence, which are without permanent or significant human habitation and are protected and managed to preserve their natural condition. So there's two elements there. There's one which says ecologically they're wild, they're intact, they have intact ecosystems, and the other which is saying that the human influence on the landscape in terms of our habitation and our infrastructure is largely minimal. And I've included some links down here as well, so I think we can share these slides later. At a European level, and this comes from the EU guidelines on wilderness in the Natura 2000, again, coincident with your Nature Conservation Act, it says a wilderness is an area governed by natural processes. It's composed of native habitats and species and large enough for the effective ecological functioning of natural processes. Again, similar to the IUCN, it says unmodified or only slightly modified by human activity without intrusive or extractive activity, settlements, infrastructure, visual disturbance. So there's a number of things going on there in terms of human impact. And of course, your Nature Conservation Act, number 60, 2013, under Article 518, wilderness areas are defined as where people do not have permanent residence or where structures do not exist or are inconspicuous. But then goes on in Article 519 to say that uninhabited wilderness is an area in the wilderness which is usually at least 25 square kilometers in size, so it's a large area. And it's large enough such that solitude and nature can be enjoyed there without the interruption from structures, traffic, motor vehicles, etc. And as a rule, is at least 5 kilometers away from structures and other technical traces such as power lines, plants, reservoirs, etc. So, and there's obviously you have the web link down there as well. So some interesting departures. One of the things that we can see here with these different definitions, and I apologize for the 1960s sort of sexist language here a little bit, but you know, it was such as the day. It says, Nash, in his book, seminal work, Wilderness and the American Mind, says that wilderness is what men think it is. And so there's an element there. It's about how we feel about place and how our cultural and educational and other background influences how we think about landscapes, and just says that, you know, one man's wilderness is another's roadside picnic ground. And what he's getting at there is to say, if you spent all of your life in Reykjavik and never gone outside of it, then the mountains around might seem wild to you. But if you've spent all of your life in a very remote farm in the Vestfjords, then it won't. Your threshold of what is wild and what isn't are likely to be different. And I guess this brings into play a series of wilderness values, if you like, and I've labelled them here as about science, about aesthetics, about services, and I'm thinking here about nature-based services and about ethics. And a couple of years ago, I wrote an article for after the World Wilderness Congress in Salamanca in 2013 for the International Journal of Wilderness, and the link is down there, about science and wilderness. And we talk about science being carried out in wilderness. So we're using wilderness areas as a study site, which is great for things like climate change and human impacts on ecosystems, because wilderness provides us with a great control for that, but also about science on wilderness, about the processes and the benefits and the meaning that wilderness has. And then science for wilderness in terms of protection and wilderness futures. But of course, it's more than just science. It's about inspiration, and we all probably know of art and literature and things which have been inspired by wilderness settings, and the feelings that creates within us. You know, our appreciation of its beauty, the fear that we perhaps fear of the unknown, and the awe of such of grand landscapes. But thinking about what wilderness can provide for us, then there's the ecosystem service model, provisioning, supporting, regulating, and the cultural benefits, the implications that has for planning and policy. And now, of course, we're into the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, the issues about climate, surrounding climate and biodiversity. But finally, I think wrapping this all up, we have certain moral obligations to protect remaining wild areas for future generations, but also for the sustainability of the planet itself. And of course, we need to recognise the intrinsic or the non-human values that are inherent in wild places and wild animals. Okay, I'm going to come back to the mapping a little bit now and think about how we do, you know, because I'm kind of trying to get across the idea that, you know, wilderness is not a distinct, definitive, and ultimately very easily measurable entity. It's quite qualitative. It depends on who we are and our experience, as well as some of these ecological considerations. So I've kind of called this slide quantifying the qualitative. And there are two approaches to this. There's the Boolean approach, where you apply the mapping and say, this is where it begins and this is where it ends. And the green areas on here are terrestrial wilderness areas. And you can see, look there, Iceland has some. And the blue areas are areas of the oceans, which have been, again, some in landlocked lakes, etc., where human impact is minimal. The other approach is to accept that it is a continuum between the most wild and the least wild. And this example from Globe Bio is a good example of that. And I would say, you know, map it or lose it. And for a long time, I resisted in my work putting lines on a map and saying, you know, this is the edge of the wildland or the wilderness and this isn't. But, you know, politicians and planners, they understand lines on maps. And it's important for decision making and support, and ultimately important for designation and protection. And there are a series of contemporary threats which Icelandic wilderness is currently facing. I mean, clearly one of those is climate change. So recently you held a wake, a ceremony to the disappearance of a glacier in the Highlands, I believe, and laid a plaque in its memory. And that's kind of indicative of some of these impacts of climate change. But one of our responses to climate change, of course, is to exploit renewable energy, and this is an example of a green-on-green impact. Renewable energy, be that hydro, wind, or geothermal in the Icelandic context, does come with impacts. Yes, it's renewable, but it has local impacts which we need to be aware of. And of course, one of the mainstays of your economy at the moment is recreation. So 4x4 off-road driving, again, does not come without certain impacts. There's been some current mapping, so I'd just like to acknowledge that based on the 2013 Nature Conservation Act definitions. So Raniveg Olafsdottir 2016 made this map at the top here, a purism scale approach to wilderness mapping. Thorri Arnason and his colleague Dave Ostman currently working on producing wilderness maps for Iceland, and there's the latest example here. And then yourselves in the Institute have your own mapping on your geoportal, which I've looked at just recently, and see your own interpretation of that. Now, all of this is based on the definition from the Nature Conservation Act, this idea of, at least in principle, 25 square kilometers in size, at least in principle 5 kilometers away from structures and other technical traces. And you see these interpreted in various manners in these maps. But the thing to point out is they are discrete, and they're using these criteria in a literal way. If you look at the scientific papers, the peer-reviewed scientific paper, and these are just some of the ones that I've been involved with, a lot of that work is using the more continuous models like the European map that I just showed you. So there's one of those European papers there, working in Scotland, working in the United States, and more recently working with colleagues in China. And this particular paper actually compares those two approaches for China, wilderness in China. And you can apply this at different scales, so be it global, or be it national, or be it within a national park. I'll show you examples that I've done in a minute. But we apply this continuum. It's just worth spending a little bit of time looking at this continuum of human modification, increasing human impact towards the left, increasing ecological integrity towards the right. And we're trying to apply this idea to mapping wild land and wilderness. And as I say, I've got a quick example here. I was in Iceland, when was it? It was pre-COVID, so it'll probably be November 2019. And do apologise if some of you have seen these slides, but it's a good local example where we were asked to help a local NGO, Earthfig, map the potential impact from a hydro power plant proposal up in the Vestfjords, which involved creating some larger lakes with dams and interbasin transfer, roads, power lines, and dramatic reduction in the volume of water flowing over some of these spectacular waterfalls. So, okay, we're talking about wilderness here, but it's important not to forget that wilderness is also about people and the values and the ecosystem services and the appreciation we get from that. And I very much enjoyed and was honoured to work with a bunch of local people. So local people living in and around the area, and geologists and lawyers and journalists and foreign funders. And that isn't a MAGA hat, by the way, there. That says making all glaciers great again. not about Donald Trump. And we got a bit of press out of this as well. So working in this area, the Dranga Peninsula, it's a very spectacular, I'm sure some of you will know it well. It's a very spectacular area. It's certainly remote. It has limited motorized access, and there's a lot of natural ecosystems up there. And I was, as I say, fortunate enough to visit and spend a little bit of time wandering around on my own and camping and just ground truthing some of my models. So what I'm trying to do here is model the size of the area, its remoteness, any access issues and visual intrusion from human features, the rugged and challenging nature of that landscape and its overall naturalness. And to do that, we've modified, I don't expect you to read this table, but it's just to say that we've modified work that we've done in Scotland on perceived naturalness of land cover, absence of modern human artifacts, rugged and challenging terrain, and remoteness from mechanized access. And to some extent, you know, I think transferring those models across which we've used to define wild areas in Scotland, we call them wild land rather than wilderness per se, because there are similarities in the landscape, not necessarily culturally, although there are some cultural overlaps, but some of the qualities of the landscape are similar. I think it's reasonable to adapt and adopt these models in Iceland. So just quickly take you through some of the maps that we developed for the Dranga Peninsula and see how those look. So perceived naturalness land cover, we used some local data on land cover. We modified the naturalness categories in that land cover data set for use in Iceland with the different land cover types that you have there to assign a naturalness class. Now in this area, a lot of the land is naturalness class 5, so it's very wild, but some areas around the edge are cultivated and grazed. Absence of modern human artifacts is based on a viewshed model. In other words, we're using terrain data with human features such as roads and airstrips and harbours and buildings, farms, etc., to work out the areas that those can be seen from. And here, in terms of the dam proposal, there are obvious changes. So we were looking at the changes to visual impact, both pre-dam construction and post-dam construction. Rugged and challenging nature of the terrain. Again, this is just based on the terrain model data. And it's just simply calculated from a statistical model looking at the overall ruggedness of that landscape. And then remoteness from mechanized access. This is a combination of terrain and mechanized access features, so the limited number of roads, but also all of the principal boat landing points around the peninsula to create this data set. And that was enabled us to generate some time access contours. So these contours you can see down here are in terms of walking time in hours, some of them optimistic depending if you're a strong walker or not. So we were able to then bring these together into the model, the multi-criteria model, to create these maps showing the patterns of wilderness quality. Now clearly when you're up on the Dranga Jökull ice cap, it's very wild there. When you're around the edge, close to the farmland and the roads, you can see one of the roads there, for example, and you in Arnesrepa, you very high or to low wilderness quality. But of course, what we need to do then to look at the impact of any development proposals is classify that as what we call core area, the buffer area, and the edge of those wild areas. And this is a rigorous, robust, and repeatable methodology. And of course, well, we don't have a photograph of the dam because it's not been built yet, and hopefully we would say shouldn't be. But this is an example that you have over in the east of the country, and by placing that dam in, you're changing the perceived naturalness of the land cover. In this instance, because you're adding water in, it implies a change in terms of lower naturalness, because these are artificial water impoundments. And we can see the impact. So high impact in the green areas, no impact or low impact in the blue areas. Same for absence of modern human artifacts, so buildings and power lines and roads, etc. So there's the map prior to dam construction. This is the map post dam construction. So with a large power line and associated roads and the changes to the water level in the local lakes and new roads in the area, very noticeable impact. And of course, we can do a subtraction, and those are the areas which will be visually impacted by this development. In terms of rugged and challenging nature of the terrain, very localized impacts caused by creating these new lakes. So you see those kind of appear, and they actually have a positive effect, reducing ruggedness, although there are local increases in ruggedness around the dam walls, etc. Remoteness from mechanized access, again, this is quite heavily impacted. So that's pre-dam construction. This is post-dam construction, assuming that you can use a four-wheel drive vehicle along those access roads for the power line and for the dam itself. And there's the area which is principally impacted by that change. So those are our wilderness quality maps as they are at present, and as they are in terms of a classified wilderness map with core, buffer and edge. And these are the post-construction, how they would look, and the changes in terms of wilderness loss, and the changes in terms of wilderness classification, put side by side for comparison. And we can also, there were some different models for the construction of the dam with different types of access and overhead or underground power lines, so we were able to model those effects as well. So it's what we would call a what-if model in terms of GIS modeling. But overall, we're basically able to say reclassify these maps to show where the areas of change would occur if this hydro scheme was actually constructed. Just say a few words before I conclude on the need for protection. I think it's obvious that with landscapes, I've travelled the world quite a lot and seen some pretty spectacular landscapes. But when I was there on my own and I came across this final waterfall before this river flows out to the fjord, I was actually gobsmacked. My breath was taken away, and I sat on this little overlook here for 20 minutes, just looking in silence. And this would be reduced to a trickle, and I think it really does require some more strict protection. I say we're working on some current mapping projects. So this is Vaneskart. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Just on the edge of the Vatnajökull ice cap in the national park. And here we're using similar techniques to model impact from a proposed extension to or a proposed route, 4x4 route to the existing 4x4 tracks in the area. And this is the blue line here. So the new route is there, and the colours there represent, these are very draft results at the moment, but they represent change in wilderness quality index or change in visibility of human features in that landscape. So we're looking here at impacts on remoteness, visual intrusion, and opportunities for solitude. Future mapping project, which is on the drawing board at the moment, but looking at Þórsorva, if I've got that right, the Hofsjökull. And this is a Ramsar site for pink-footed goose breeding area, these wetland areas in front of the glacier here. and its potential has potential to be a designated wilderness, and we're going to map wilderness quality and character in the area to help define those boundaries. So combining the Nature Conservation Act definitions with those from the IUCN Category 1B guidelines. So just to conclude, I think I've run out of time nicely there. I think it's, because you have this, and it's a useful figure, 43% of Europe's top 1% wildest areas are in Iceland, and that's a great benefit to you as Icelanders. It's a great figure, I think, to bandy around. It's probably great for tourism, although I can see things there, but it's also, I think you need to think about that possibly a bit more carefully when thinking about some of these resource exploitation opportunities. And having that information is really critical to thinking about the future of development in the country, and not just in the Central Highlands. I would say that wilderness, these variations in wilderness quality and character are best mapped using these continuous and fuzzy definitions laid on top of the definitions from the Nature Conservation Act and the existing mapping that you have already. I think there's a good opportunity there to do some interesting collaborative work. And recently you've had this bill of law passed just in February this year, which makes amendments to the Conservation Act, which makes this kind of mapping mandatory. But it also presents, I think, an opportunity to supplement the existing definition with some of these more fuzzy definitions, these nuanced maps, which can help with planning and policy. And some of the assumptions in the mapping criteria therein, with reference to the IUCN Category 1B and the EU Wilderness Guidelines. So those are my conclusions. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I've certainly enjoyed working with these people in doing this mapping work. And any questions?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Steve.
Oops, I'm trying to get out of it now.
Komið með spurningar til Steve. Það eru örugglega margar spurningar. Þetta var mjög athyglisverður fyrirlestur. Ég ætla kannski að spyrja hérna á einni. Steve, what does your mapping approach add to the existing wilderness maps for Iceland, and how is it different?
Yeah, I think the current maps have interpreted those definitions from the Nature Conservation Act quite literally. There's been some experimentation on that, looking at people's different perceptions of those. The idea that these are areas of a certain size, and there's that in principle saying 25 square kilometers. And in principle, more than 5 kilometers away from roads, etc. How you go further than that in terms of better informing internal variations of wilderness quality and character. I would say that the continuous mapping gives you more information, and it doesn't reduce it down to a sort of on-off type criteria. They're more they are continuous criteria, which allows you to better map and model impacts from proposed developments, such that they're a bit more meaningful.
Okay, thank you. There's one question from Agnes. Why is the ruggedness of the landscape a criterion for wilderness? There are smooth natural landscapes as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always been an interesting one. Ruggedness has an impact not just on terms of perceptions of wildness, but also it overlaps with aesthetics. So I think probably the wildest place on Earth is the Antarctic Plateau in terms of literal definitions, and yet it's completely flat, pretty much. So it isn't rugged, and yet it's completely wild. Rugged landscapes attract the eye. They feel wilder because they have scale and scenic grandeur. So ruggedness is an interesting one. You're right, in that flat landscapes can be wild, but they perhaps feel less wild. And one of the advantages of which I should have mentioned to the earlier question, of the continuous data model within a multi-criteria approach, is you can weight these. So if you think that actually ruggedness isn't that important in mapping and modeling wilderness in Iceland in certain areas, you can give that a much lower weight, so less priority, and give more priority to naturalness and to remoteness.
Okay, so in your continuous data model, how do you normalize your data, or weight them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Technically speaking, that ruggedness is measured on a different set of units to remoteness. We measure remoteness in terms of time taken to walk, taking terrain and barrier features into account. So that's seconds. Ruggedness is curvature, standard deviation of curvature. Naturalness is a reclassification of land cover. So they're all in different units. So you must in these kinds of models, you must standardize. And we use a normalization process, which is pretty straightforward statistically, but there are other models available. So we just use the equal interval slice function, which is available in the GIS software. Sorry, getting a bit geeky there. But yes, there are different ways of normalizing, but you must normalize before attempting to combine different layers which are measured in different units.
Okay, so how are your methods that you use customizable to other different areas or countries?
Yes, I mean, I said that we've adapted the models that we used in Scotland because Scotland and Iceland. Iceland is clearly wilder and more remote, but the landscapes are similar. You have glaciers, we don't. Yes, I mean you can modify the model by including or excluding certain input layers. And you can modify the model by weighting the layers differently. So, for example, when we applied this approach to mapping wilderness character in the United States for the National Park Service, and we did a feasibility study in Death Valley National Park, and then we applied the model to a range of other national parks covering different landscape types, from Denali down to some desert and small mountain environments in the east of the US. We included a whole range of different, actually there were 52 different data inputs, generating 13 different intermediate layers, and then ultimately 4 final qualities of naturalness, degree of management, remoteness, and opportunity for solitude. So the basic model remains the same. It's just that you adapt for different countries with different landscapes and different cultural backgrounds. You can adapt the inputs and adapt the way that they're weighted to take those into account.
Okay, so here's one from Swain. Could such an approach also approximate it to marine environment?
Yes, I've personally only worked in what we call near or inshore marine environments. But you know, the marine environment brings a whole series of different challenges, and you know, one of which is that as humans, we tend to, most of us anyway, at least, tend to just inhabit a two-dimensional landscape. On land, it's what we call a three-dimensional landscape because we've got altitude. On marine environments, we're just bobbing around on the surface in boats, unless we're a scuba diver. And so that brings a whole series of challenges. It's also a fluid environment in that, okay, barring a GPS unit, you are in a fluid environment where there are different impacts on feelings of remoteness, and you know, tidal effects and the swell and all of those things really do make things very different for us. So my experience has been looking at inshore marine areas where we've been looking at modeling accessibility for people using certain types of surface craft, so sea kayaks, ribs, rigid inflatable boats, and yachts. But yeah, it is an interesting one. The other thing about it, with it being a fluid two-dimensional environment, is you can go pretty much anywhere you want with your whatever craft that you're in. There's no restrictions such as barrier features, etc. You know, excluding shallows and extreme riptides, perhaps. So it is a different approach that's required.
Okay, thank you. Maybe there's one here, little technical question. When you were mapping absence of human artifacts, usually the method you draw a buffer around features, but can you describe in few words how you do it?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you can put those buffers around those features and say, you know, if you're more than 5 kilometers from a road, particularly the gravel roads that you have in some of the central areas of Iceland, it's very difficult to see those, even if you do have direct line of sight. However, the models that we've developed are based on visibility. So using a terrain model to work out whether there is line of sight between the human feature of interest and the observer. And you can do that in standard GIS tools, but it takes an awful long time to do millions of these calculations. So we've developed our own software for doing this, and Thori Anderson and David Osman are actually using that software now to look at sighting and impact of wind energy installations in Iceland. And it takes distance decay and partial visibility into account. So it's a lot more sophisticated than simple buffer zones, but it's more sophisticated than the off-the-shelf visibility tools that are available in standard off-the-shelf GIS.
Okay, thank you. Then there's here one last question from Lovisa. How difficult and how much time would it take to map the wilderness of Iceland using your method?
Well, a lot depends on the resolution at which you wish to do that. I mean, clearly it's already been mapped at a European resolution, and those were 1 kilometer grid square resolution data sets. However, you know, that was a European model. It makes an awful lot of sense to have a national model and then individual local models with yet more detail for particular instances, like the work that we're currently doing in Vonnegut. So how long? Yeah, how long is a piece of string? The viewshed models do take a long time to run. They're faster in terms. I mean, we did some back of the envelope calculations on how long it would take using standard GIS software, and we'd all be dead by the time it finished. Our software is several thousand times faster. because it's based on computer gaming, so first-person shooter type technology, ray casting, if you're interested. But yeah, how long? Yeah, a few months maybe, with a small team working on it constantly.
Okay, thank you,
That's
Steve. I think
that's just a guess. That's a wild guess, but yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This was the last question. I think Maria is here to take over.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Sigmar, thank you for your assistance. Now it's coming to an end with us today.